Alright everyone, welcome to the video. This is the intro. Welcome friends, family, everyone else. So I love Dark Souls, I love Skyrim, and it's hard for me to believe and even remember that they came out in the same year. Because all I remember at the time is Skyrim and 11-11-11. So I wanted to make a video talking about them. And as two games that I love, now looking back, how to me, it seems as if Dark Souls 1 actually has a longer half-life in the cultural sphere and quality-wise than Skyrim, which is something I never would have said at the time, or even a few years ago. Okay, so let's get down to business here. So why is this game called Dark Souls? It's called such because of all humans having a part of the dark soul that the furtive pygmy had. This guy here is the furtive pygmy. There are a ton of YouTube videos about Dark Souls lore. I searched up Dark Souls just to do my own research and kind of look around, and I like to watch the videos anyway. And it's amazing how many gaming essays there are 7 years later talking about the game, hours and hours, 6 hours, 9 hours long, with millions of views. It's something that people are really interested in, and there's something about Dark Souls that really captures that interest. But even without the lore that's hard to understand, it somehow feels like the most lived-in gaming world, the most real world I've ever played. As I write this, I'm sipping my coffee, and it's good. It's a bit like Dark Souls in that way. It's not warm or welcoming like my coffee, but it's a part of the routine. It's got a kick to it, it's black. And I keep wanting to go back for more. Now the first time I played Dark Souls 1, I started out on Elden Ring. I was so excited by the hype. That was actually the first game I played. I bought it on release, just kind of spontaneously. My friends were loving it. So I guess it wasn't quite on release. It must have been a few days after, but anyways, I bought it within the week. And boy, I loved it. And so I said, I better go back and play the others. So that first adventure into Dark Souls 1, I actually quit. It was overwhelming. I felt that it was a significant step down from Elden Ring, and I gave up at the Asylum Demon. I thought, man, this game was touted as being hard, but this just feels too clunky. I don't have this kind of time. Why would I be doing this when I have a game like Elden Ring? Why don't I play some of the newer ones like Sekiro or Bloodborne? Little did I know I was being fooled, and that I had not yet seen Dark Souls 1 for what it was. In the 2011 interview, Miyazaki was interviewed, the game director, about Dark Souls 1, about designing the game. So he gave the game designers a few image words and allowed them to create from there. He really empowered the artists, which is cool to see, and boy does it come through. I remember the first time I booted up Dark Souls 1, that same playthrough that I quit, I was in awe of how that asylum felt. It was atmospheric, maybe the most atmospheric game I'd ever played. If anything, it was almost too dark. Elden Ring I'd consider a fairly bright game. You have the air tree constantly glowing when you're in the overworld. Dark Souls 1 doesn't have that. There's a looming darkness sort of painting everything around you. And there's nothing darker than starting out in an asylum, watching a knight, once proud, dying, sending you on a last mission. It's depressing right from the start. You meet a few characters, the knight, the man who greets you upon leaving the asylum, but you feel lonely. Here's a quote from Miyazaki. I believe that if your instructions are too specific, the designs you get will be somewhat devoid of creativity. So I try to give out just the most basic, essential information, before handing it over to the artist's imaginations, which inevitably eclipses my own. Boy, he sounds like a great guy to work for. And it's this creativity that allowed for the atmosphere of Dark Souls 1. That's what people remember when they think about Dark Souls 1. That's what I remember. Sure, the combat was pretty darn good at the time for essentially innovating and starting a new style of game. And the story is interesting once you delve into it and learn what's going on. But it's the interconnectedness. It's the world. It's the atmosphere. It's how it feels like the world around you is alive. Another Miyazaki quote. You may not believe me, but I always tried to maintain a certain level of refinement and elegance in all designs. I often told the artists that muddy or messy is definitely not good. I think this carries through the entire game. If you asked me to describe what this elegance is, well, I think you just have to look at the designs and judge for yourself. But it really is one of the most important factors in everything I oversee. I believe him. Dark Souls 1 carries a dark, simple elegance. I wouldn't describe the game as muddy or messy, although it is tempting a bit to see it in that way. Everything appears very dirty, but it's dark rather than dirty. It's dark, it's gothic, it's medieval. It's akin to when you see a plague doctor in a painting. There's something ominous just lurking beyond the surface of what you're looking at. It's as if there's a hidden implication in the darkness around you, just as there's a hidden implication in the plague doctor wearing the mask. There would be no mask on the doctor if there was no plague. Just as in Dark Souls, there would be no darkness if there was no loss of humanity. If there was no hollowing. At least not to the level of darkness that we see. For example, in the game, spoiler alert, when you kill Guinevere and the daylight vanishes in Anor Londo, casting darkness over it. This removes all the normal enemies in the game and places some new NPCs, some strong ones, in the actual interior of Anor Londo. You lose the Anor Londo bonfire. Essentially, you're dispelling the illusion that Anor Londo was light. It's a beautiful mechanic, and it makes you distrust everything around you. And it makes you wonder how much of the light you're seeing is actually darkness hiding. Now, in 2011, I was in a bit of a bubble. I was solely focused on 11, 11, 11. I was in a Skyrim bubble. It's so fascinating to me that they came out in the same year, just a month and a half apart. How different, but how alike. Both infinitely replayable, and like the hare and the tortoise, Skyrim took a big fast lead, but over time, Dark Souls 1, the tortoise, has been catching up in terms of attention to it, looking back on it, the hours played. It won the 2021 Golden Joysticks Game of the Ever, something like that. It's timeless in a way that Skyrim may not be eventually. Now, I love Skyrim. I've played it, probably my most played game. Whenever I tell people that, they always think I'm pretty basic. I get it. I mean, I love the game. It came out at a perfect time for me in high school. It struck all the right chords. My freshman year of high school, I think. It was amazing. And I loved every minute of it. I used to watch the trailers for every little detail. I'd loved Oblivion, and I couldn't wait to see what they were doing with a Nordic, snowy setting, and with dragons. I loved the dragons. I was so excited. And so I was curious to hear what Todd Howard had to say about their design philosophy compared to Miyazaki. A quote from him: "One of the reasons our games end up so big is we put a high premium on tools, and then we let people run wild. We think that gives us the best game. So the main thing that we try to instill in people is really the tone of the game. And then they'll create content that matches that. And the work will be checked by lots of people, and it won't be me all the time. It often isn't. Now it's interesting, at this point, hearing that and comparing it to Miyazaki's statement, they sound very similar. They sound very laissez-faire. They give him a little bit of direction and let the artists run with it. He says they try to instill in people the tone of the game, much like Miyazaki gives a few image words. And then their developers, their artists, designers, create content that matches that. It's interesting because the philosophy is very similar, but they achieved a very different thing. The vague directions that each Todd Howard and Miyazaki director were pointing their developers, their artists, their designers in, one was north and one was south. You have Skyrim. It's snowy, bright, vast landscapes, mountainous, large open world sandbox. Of course, they're different games. But then you have Dark Souls 1, interconnected, dark, of course, moody. Whereas Skyrim doesn't really have any interconnectedness at all. It doesn't necessarily feel alive in the same way that Dark Souls 1 does. The world feels like a community. Skyrim feels like a bunch of town assets and caves and random houses and so forth placed on a map, but there's no central structure combining them together. Another quote from Todd Howard: "When it comes to game features, the more time you spend on paper, the more incorrect assumptions you're making, and it's just going to pile up on you." This is where there's an important distinction that they do make. Todd goes vague on game features, but quests, design, items, over at Bethesda they get very specific. Miyazaki appears to differ in this way, and the design speaks to that. Dark Souls feels alive. Skyrim, even with its radiant AI and all that stuff, never truly feels that alive. I remember seeing Mike the Liar walking about, but the people in towns that have their set schedules, the random merchants, don't add that much to that world that I said wasn't really connected. There's no central DNA. It's particularly lonely when you're out there, really. And the design is sort of generic Nordic fantasy. It's beautiful, don't get me wrong, but Skyrim, the land, is not a character. In Dark Souls, especially 1, that's the thing that people take away most when I talk with my friends about it, more than anything, is the design, the world, the interconnectedness. It's a fundamental difference. Obviously, they're different games in their styles, in their genres. One is a sandbox, the other is an action-adventure RPG, Soulslike thing game. But that difference is not why the art and the feel of the environment is different. They could have been similar in that way, but it's really that fundamental philosophy that makes Dark Souls 1 timeless over Skyrim, in my opinion. The Gothic Vow of Dark Souls 1. Something I like to do as a writer, it's a skill that's required to write, is to find new ways to say simple things, or to be able to capture a certain moment or a certain experience in ways that maybe no one else can quite put it. What makes a good writer is not writing many words people don't understand. It's not about being able to tell every single detail of every single scene. It's about holding that balance between description and imagination. As I'll talk about, this is something that the developers of Skyrim and Dark Souls, Miyazaki and Todd Howard, do very well. and it's something I considered when making this video. I find it to be a fun challenge. Sometimes I like to think about the games I play and think about a little phrase that really captures the meaning of the game, or how I felt playing it. For me, playing Dark Souls 1, that phrase is a gothic vow. When you first wake up in your cell in the undead asylum, and that knight looks down at you and offers you a way out, when you pick up that key, you're assuming you're taking on a vow. And then even later, when you find the knight, crippled, essentially, dying, and you accept his words. I mean, you can say no and not listen to him, but you hear what he has to say. He offers you guidance, and you take that, and you leave the asylum. What Dark Souls 1 is more than anything is a vow to keep trying, to remain powerful, courageous, sometimes wildly frustrated, but you're taking a vow to take the game for what it is. It's just a brutal challenge. It'll teach you a lot about yourself. It might even teach you how to deal with some emotional issues you go through when playing games or just in general. So when you first land on that Firelink shrine, you're looking around, you realize that when you chose to escape from the undead asylum, when you picked up your sword, your weapon, and you fought back, you accepted that gothic vow. You are the chosen undead, the tarnished. And boy, does it feel good. The definition of Gothic: of or relating to a style of fiction characterized by the use of desolate or remote settings and macabre, mysterious, or violent incidents. Now, don't know how else I'd describe Dark Souls besides as desolate, remote, mysterious, violent. It is a Gothic game. But what's so interesting about it is even though it's desolate and it's remote, you never really feel lonely. And that's the beauty of the vow you take on as the chosen undead. You are the lucky one. And the thing about the Gothic vow is that it's something you don't just accept once. It's something you accept every single time you come alive again. When you're vanquished by your foes, dozens, hundreds of times fighting any particular boss, and you choose to go back and fight again, that's you taking that vow. And for the definition of vow, to promise solemnly, one by which a person is bound to an act, service, or condition. That's you. You're the chosen undead. You took the vow to keep on fighting, to live another day, and to fulfill the centuries-old prophecy to ring the bell of awakening. That's the beauty of it for me. It's that prompt you're given every single time you're defeated. Every time you die trying to get back to your souls and you never quite recover them. That's the beauty of it. It's the story that's told, the Gothic story that you're surrounded by through the environmental details, the text, even the way the characters talk. It's all of that that makes you want to keep accepting your mission as the chosen undead. And so that's why it's so interesting looking back at 2011. Good year for games. But Skyrim and Dark Souls 1 were the real overachievers. You had many other great ones, of course, like Portal 2, Batman Arkham City, LA Noire. There's a bunch of good games that came out. Some people really like Assassin's Creed Revelations. You had the Warhammer 40k. There were a decent amount of good games, and these two really stuck out above the rest. You know, Portal 2 and Arkham City, I think, are also really great games. Battlefield 3 is another one of my favorites. But these games did something different. And it's an interesting case study to look at them next to each other. But in the end, what leaves me feeling more strongly and thinking about Dark Souls 1 more than Skyrim is that gothic vow that Skyrim doesn't offer. It never gives you a question such as that. Will you accept it? Rather, that game essentially says, hey, here's a sandbox, go play, see what you can find, see what you can make. We have all kinds of toys in there for you to play with. But it doesn't offer you a challenge every single time you play it. And on top of that, it's not a gothic challenge. That's what makes it extra special. The darkness surrounding you never makes you feel alone, because you're always being asked the question, will you accept the vow? So yeah, that's the gothic vow. That's kind of my gothic vow theory, my gothic vow, whatever you want to call it. I had fun with the video. Still trying to figure out all of the thumbnail stuff, but it's been a fun ride, and yeah, hopefully you guys like it. Really appreciate everyone watching, especially if you got to this point. Like and subscribe, that'd be awesome. But yeah, gonna keep on doing videos in this style probably. It was a lot of fun. Just trying to capture that feeling of Dark Souls 1 into a phrase and to talk about it in sort of, literary terms, as many have before me. So anyway, thanks for watching, guys.